For my speech topic, I chose why I am for prayer in Christian schools. Now, obviously, being a Christian, this was an easy choice for me to take, or an easy choice for me to choose. But I was looking online and I found one site which is School Prayer in America, and it tells a little bit about the history of how the public school became to be, how schooling outside the being homeschooled uh, sort of initiated itself. But in colonial America, homeschooling and the schools were ran by churches that were very common. Now, towards the end of the colonial periods, homeschooling wasn't as popular because they started to have the entity of an institution or schooling come into play. But the first settlers in America felt that it was important that children should learn to read so they could read their Bibles. And, of course, learning right from wrong and other means of literature and things like that. But on down the article, I'm reading this verbatim, it says, a part of the daily curriculum, students were taught to pray and read using the Bible. Later in 1960, the New England Primer was introduced, which taught spelling, reading, and the alphabet using Bible verses, thus teaching both reading and Bible morals at the same time. Daily school prayer was a natural part of the educational system. After the American Revolution, Noah Webster introduced the Blue Book Speller, which also used Bible verses to teach reading and spelling. In 1836, the McGuffey Reader was introduced, which also featured Bible verses to teach moral values. The school system produced some of the world's brightest inventors and set the Industrial Revolution in motion. The school continued to run mostly by Christian churches until the 1890s, at which point states started to take control of the existing schools. By 1900s, many other textbooks were used, and they all have Bible quotes in them. Now, obviously, the biggest thing to derive from this was between 1690 to 1900s. Obviously, Christianity was still very important. But as the 20th century began, many classrooms started each day with a Pledge of Allegiance and a prayer and a reading from the Bible. It's still in the whole Christian bubble, so to speak, but you can tell it's starting to make changes. And many churches turn their schools over to the state to run the educational system. And this is where you start to see the twist start to come around. And obviously we all know the twist happens in the 1960s. But it started a little bit prior to that. And that's when I found that information here on this site. It says that America had one of the best school systems in the world. The first crack of the moral school system occurred in 1925 when the newly formed ACLU paid a teacher in Tennessee to teach evolution. And Bible creation had been taught throughout the land, and teaching evolution was against the Tennessee state law. While the ACLU lost the case, it set in motion a re-evaluation of teaching science. Within 4 decades, the law was reversed so that now teaching creation was outlawed and teaching evolution was mandatory. And this is where we start to see the twist begin to slowly unfold in America. And at the very end of this site, it said the ACLU then started using the courts to change the school policy. In 1948, the Supreme Court used a separation of church and state to outlaw a time for school prayer. In 1962, the Supreme Court again declared that prayer in school was unconstitutional, and in 1963, the Warren Court stopped schools from allowing Bible readings in classes. In 1890, the Supreme Court declared that posting the Ten Commandments in a school classroom violated the Constitution of the United States. For two of my visual aids, I chose one being the Supreme Court and one being of children and a teacher praying in a classroom. I figured those two went very well with what I just read from this internet site. But I thought it was funny how you can see a moral decline happen between the 1960s till today. And in fact, I found a article online with a guy named Barry Burgle who said the exact same thing, saying that he had noticed, he actually made a chart, but he didn't post it on this site, saying how uh, the movement of homosexuality to any other type of anything that goes in regards to Christianity has increased since the 1960s. And he said the effect of this ruling is not just to eat away the sadness of the name of God, but to eliminate the sacredness and thereby the substance of the oath itself. Within solemn oaths and binding contracts between individuals removed, the state eventually sits where God ought to be, and only the state's cause is held valid. There is no longer an absolute and just legal basis for judging. And he used a verse in Deuteronomy where he subphrased it, said, between a man and his brother, much less a man and his neighbor, and all affairs of life become subject to state rather than individual control. But I thought he made a very good point when he said that it made a huge difference in morals and everything else from the 1960s. And Matthew 16:26, where it states that, what does it benefit a man to gain the whole world but to lose his soul? And what will he give to acquire such? In my third source, and visual aid is my Bible. And I thought how that verse can kind of sum up a little bit of what's going on in the past 40 or more years, ever since prayer was removed from school.